Lunch is delayed a minute. Matt's going to get started. Lunch will come in 20 minutes or so. Matt's going to take a pause. We'll grab our lunch, and he'll take back off. So huge thanks to Altabank for providing us lunch and putting on this lecture series. Thanks to iHub for providing this space for us to gather and learn and grow from incredible entrepreneurs like Matthew. Matt built and sold Spiff to Salesforce. Big, big deal. Huge success. Matt is now teaches his 3 boys at home, homeschools his children, and also engaged in 3 different boards. He stays busy post-transaction, but this is what we're striving to do, right? We're striving to build our businesses and sell them so that we have a lot of freedom. We can do a lot of things. We can make a difference in the world. We can make a difference in other people's lives. So thank you to Utah Valley. What are you? Chamber. I was trying to say Business Bureau. Chamber of Commerce for putting this on and bringing us all together. Huge thanks to them. Huge thanks to Altabank. And huge thanks to our guest, Matt Stapleton, today. Great friend. Let's give it up for Matthew.
Okay. You guys can hear me. It sounds like I'm coming through the speakers. I just want to make sure for anyone that might be online. Okay. I'm excited to be here. Like Corbin said, we will do some of the topics here before lunch. And when lunch gets here, we'll take a break, let everyone grab some food, and then I will keep going a little bit, which should be awesome because we should have good time to go into this. So I was mentioning to Nico, I think, coming in here, that the signs on the doors say a different topic than I'm actually going to cover. And so there's a little bit of a bait and switch there. I apologize, everyone. I'll take it. It probably got more people here because I'm going to do the boring topic of Finance 101, basically. So a little bit, I'm super excited about this, and I'm hoping that I can make everyone in the room excited about this as well. So as Corbin mentioned, we sold Spiff about 1.5 years ago to Salesforce for just shy of $500 million. That was my co-founder and I. That was actually our 3rd exit that we'd had. We'd sold a services business a while before that for about $2 million, and then a cap table management, a direct competitor to Carta, if anyone's familiar with them, for about $20 million to a subsidiary of Morgan Stanley. So I spent 1.5 years working effectively for Morgan Stanley after selling that one, and then spent about 1 year at Salesforce after that one. And I was kind of having a conversation with these guys over here. I'm a weird founder because I very much consider myself a founder first. It's what I've done my whole career. I'm focused on the founder thing, but I'm no good at sales. I've done it. I've done okay at sales, but anytime I try to scale up as like a sales leader or anything, I'm horrible at that. I'm ultimately antisocial, and so I mentioned that I'm a high-performing introvert, meaning that like I can turn it on for about an hour, and then I go slink back to my car to like play my phone games or whatever. I'm not an extrovert at all. I'm also not technical. And so I can code okay. I can read code, especially most back-end languages, but I'm not what you would consider a technical co-founder. I am like the quintessential Alfred, the butler that like makes sure all of the trains stay on the tracks. I'm good at finance, but again, I don't have a finance background. Like I didn't do accounting here. I did an entrepreneurship emphasis here. So I've kind of trained on that side. But I actually think that it qualifies me fairly well to teach this to founders because finance can be boring. It is also how you keep a pulse on your business. And so for me, absolutely, like, sometimes I will talk to finance people and they are so proud of how smart they are, which is awesome. And my entire career has been selling to them. And so, like, I say that with all the affection that I can give. They're super proud of how smart they are, but they can make it sound so complicated and go off into like Black-Scholes and different valuation methodologies and different parts of the tax code, or, you know, different things like that. That all is important. Understanding all of that's important, but there's an element of just core finance that feels like as you get better at it and as you're able to read the financial statements and as you're able to figure out what are the metrics that most matter to your business, for me, it honestly starts to feel like playing a musical instrument, where I'm getting like a lighter and a more sensitive touch, where like there's a difference. And I play piano, and so not well, but I play piano, and I can feel the difference between like pounding out a song and like really being able to play music. There's an element of that here. So we're gonna stay basic. I apologize, there's people in here with a finance background that good chunks of today's conversation is gonna be somewhat mind-numbingly simple. And I would hope for those people, I'd love any comments that you may have, other insights that you may have. But I'm intentionally going to the simple because my experience is the simple that I'm going to go over here is all that I've really needed to be a CFO of fairly large tech companies. Spiff, we raised about $120 million, and this stuff was most of what I needed for that. And also, my experience is entrepreneurs need to be able to wear all the hats. You rarely need to, especially as you get the opportunity to start to scale, you don't have to be the best at that hat. You're gonna hire people that are better at you than you for a lot of different things, and finance will absolutely be one of those. But at the same time, understanding how to, it's kind of going back to the music analogy, understanding how to read the sheet music and be able to generally understand what's going on and know what matters and what matters less, I'll go back for a second, is going to matter for you as entrepreneurs and is going to be able to let you make much more nuanced changes in your business to be able to get to success. And I do think, and I would argue my co-founder would definitely agree, my ability to kind of nuancedly navigate on the finance side has helped us avoid some like awful pitfalls that we've watched businesses around us fall into, but we've been able to avoid them by being able to make kind of subtle changes on the finance side. So with that, let's look here a bit at my agenda. We're gonna start and we're gonna spend a third to a half the time just making sure everyone's got a really good understanding of financial statements. We're then gonna spend some time talking about metrics and dashboards. I've got one slide to kind of call out the month close process, and then we'll spend some time on financial modeling. I am not by any means going to actually go in depth on the financial modeling side. That's probably the Finance 201 version of this conversation. Any questions or comments or anything before we dive in? Yeah, Corbin. Yep. I also think that sometimes you get begrudgingly good at things as an entrepreneur that you never had any intention to get good at. So this is one of those places that, like, I'd comment to my board at Spiff that I'd kind of begrudgingly became a good CFO, not because I'd had any intention to be a CFO, but because we didn't have someone else to do it. And then as we continued to scale up and things, I got good at it. And it mattered, but you end up wearing a lot of different hats. And for a chunk of time, this is one of them. And for lots of us, this is a hat that you may not take off. You may hire a bookkeeper to kind of help with some things, but that like strategic CFO type focused person only makes sense when a company scales to a certain size. So with that, let's dive into financial statements. Okay, the first one here we're going to talk about is the profit. Oh, yeah.
At what size does it make sense to hire like a strategic CFO or VP of finance?
So the question was, at what size does it make sense to hire like a strategic CFO, head of finance? This is one of those times I'll lean on the it depends. It depends on the business, the complexity of the business. You're looking for a heuristic there. I mean, like I said, for me on our last company, I kept the title all the way through to us exiting. But I hired a really good VP of finance that ultimately made me look better every day, right around when we had 45 to 50 employees. And he was huge, and I wouldn't have lasted much longer without him, with some of the other hats I was wearing. So heuristically there, I would say there are groups that do a good job. CFO is a role that you can kind of do the outsourced CFO thing for a while. But I will say some of the things that we talk about today, pay attention to, because there's things you'll miss if you just think this is something you can throw over the fence and ignore.
From experience, I would say 4 pages of P&L. Once you go about 4 pages, you need somebody else to read it.
Yeah. Yep.
It's a good rule of thumb. When your P&L gets to be more than 4 pages, you never won't take time because you're not hurting. And number 2, it gets complicated. So just good rule of thumb. I got 4 pages I'm generating. I need somebody to look at those.
Yeah, directionally, I would agree.
The other thing is, when you're looking at these basic financial documents, if you're hung up with trying to understand those, then you can't project out what you're going to do because you're hung up on what you've got behind you. So it's very important that you know what your numbers are, so that if you and I are sitting across the table, I'm making an offer to you, you already know whether it's something you can absorb or not.
Yep, I would agree. And the statement here, just for anyone on the camera, was if you're hung up on these basic financials, then it's hard to kind of project out or estimate anything out of that. That's what I want to focus on here is, like I said, finance does sometimes obfuscate how simple this actually is. And they'll add a lot of complexity that just makes it so that your eyes glaze over when you're seeing a bunch of numbers. I want to stay out of that today and understand that, like, regardless of whose P&L it is, this isn't a hard document to understand when you can peel back the layers of extra junk they've added in. Corbin, did you have something you were going to say?
Quickly, Matt, the one thing I was going to add is a bookkeeper can do a lot for you in the first year, year and a half of your business. You have to have accurate accounting. You can look at the financial statements Matt's about to teach you about, but if the information's wrong, it's not giving you what you need. And to pay somebody to do your bookkeeping for you, put correct information in so you get correct information out. That would be a basic first step. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. And I hire a bookkeeper every time. I'm good at this stuff, but having someone that can just kind of make sure that it happens consistently is important. But then I ask really stupid questions of like, hey, that number there, what is that? And they're like, oh, it's your blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay. show me, and I push them though, I'll also push them on like, show me the receipts associated with that, because again, there's such a temptation to not look dumb. Be like, oh yeah, the blah, 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 you know, and let them keep going on their thing. But pushing them on like, okay, what really is that has mattered to me, because I have a hard time keeping the pulse and like feeling the pulse of the business when those things get too obfuscated. Okay, let's dive in. So, profit and loss statement, also called an income statement. So if you've heard those terms, it's the exact same thing. Or P&L, that's short for the profit and loss. It's all the same thing, just different names for the same thing. We're going to go through our whole example today with a lemonade stand. And so you can see here, this is kind of my most simple profit and loss statement. So I ran a lemonade stand. I show at the top my revenue was I sold 100 cups of lemonade at $1 a cup. So I'm showing revenue of $100. Down lower, I've got all my expenses laid out here. So I bought a bunch of lemons, I bought sugar, I bought cups, I bought ice, I bought a stand for $75. I've got this John's Cut. We don't know what that is right now. I assume that I hired my neighbor friend John to help out, and I paid him $20 for helping out at my lemonade stand. All that, add it all up, and I've got $124 of expenses, $100 of revenue, $124 in expenses. It means I lost $24. Okay? That right there is a P&L. Anyone could put it together. This is just the physical things that I would have running a lemonade stand. But that right there is a P&L. We're going to make this more complicated a few times from here. So if you're saying, well, where's your such and such? I expect it will show up. But pausing before I go past that, any questions on what we're looking at? Okay, let's organize this a little bit more to give me a little bit more information about the business. So before I start this, and if that's lunch for a bunch of people, that's probably in here. Yeah, sorry, man. I think we've got a table over on the far side for you. Okay, so this is the exact same numbers that I just showed you. So nothing has changed as far as the underlying information. You can still see revenue, $100 at the top. My income at the bottom is the negative $24. I lost $24 on this. But I've added in this concept of cost of goods sold. And often for a business, it is helpful to differentiate the very specific costs that went into producing the thing that you sold. So in my lemonade example, I've moved cups and sugar and lemons and ice up into this cost of goods sold, because I bought those things literally to make these cups that I then sold to people. And it's helpful for me to know. So you can see here I've got $100 total revenue. I've got $29 of cost of goods sold to show $71 of revenue after that. And that can be helpful, just understanding that, because there's certain businesses that it's really important to understand how much of my money is getting through just the cost to make the thing. And I've had situations where that gross revenue number after the cost of goods sold is negative. That's not a good sign. Because it means literally I'm spending $150 to buy all of the stuff, I'm packaging it up and selling it for $100, and I could do that 1,000,000 times, and I'm just going to lose more and more and more money. And I've seen that in businesses without the business realizing that was happening. You know, where you go through and you kind of explain like, okay, let's pull this together and say like, yep, they're telling me, yeah, we just need to sell more. We need to get our sales reps going and stuff like that. I'm like, no, you don't need to sell more. You got to work through this. There's also more nuanced versions of this. I'll give you an example. I've got a family member who sells grain, buys bags of flour, sells bags of flour. And when we looked at his business, one of the hardest elements of his business was the fact that he would sell a 50-pound bag of flour for $48. He would buy it from the farmer for $46. It was positive, but the numbers of bags that he had to sell to make anything like real money was crazy. And it obfuscated because he sold a lot of bags and he had a lot of revenue, but like 96% of that revenue is going to pay the farmer for those bags of grain. And so looking at that, one of the most important things we did with his business is made him go back to the farmer and say, like, I can't afford to buy these bags from you at $46 a bag. And he was able to negotiate that down. I think he went down to like $37 a bag type of thing. And suddenly that business is looking a lot different, right? And it's this concept. It's the being able to understand what's going into the actual cost of the product is a really useful element of this P&L statement. Now, couple additional things before I move beyond that. I've got cost of goods sold. That's a common name you hear here. You'll also hear things like cost of revenue, especially when it's not a physical good. So, for example, if I run a software business, I may not be selling physical goods to someone, but there's still costs to selling that software. It might be things like my hosting costs with Amazon or Google Cloud, or sometimes it makes sense to put like your support team up as a cost of revenue in that situation because you couldn't provide the revenue without that support team. And so it makes more sense to put them rather than elsewhere. But all I'm doing here at the end of the day is I'm just categorizing expenses. So if you see this, all I've done is I've grouped those cost of goods sold expenses up above. Down below, I still have that stand for $75 and John's cut for $20. And I've still got the negative $24 at the bottom. Any questions before we get more complicated than this? Okay. Next step. This is the exact same thing we just looked at. January is the same numbers that we were just looking at. I've just added 5 more months. And again, I'm being really intentional about the steps here because my experience is my VP of Finance will slap this in front of someone on the team that isn't as familiar with it, and their eyes will glaze over because there's a lot of numbers there. This is the same thing that we were looking at, exact same numbers. You can see the negative $24 in January. I've just added the extra months, and for me, this is super valuable because I can start to see trend lines. I can start to see things like, if you look at my revenue, I'm going from $100 to $225 a month in revenue. I can see that, and that helps me understand, like, is this business growing? Is it not growing? Just details around that. I can look at other things, and I can see, like, I had $75 I spent for a stand on month 1. Is that something that I have to spend every month? Or is it kind of a one-time upfront? And I can see what that looks like and start to get a sense. And then I can look at the net income on this and see that, like, that's improving over time. And so I'm getting more and more insight on that side. So having this month over month is super valuable. But again, I'm trying to avoid saying this is how you should do it every time, because every business is different and there's weird nuance to your business. And so understanding that nuance will help you kind of guide and actually get insight out of this. And things that I found that have been really important, like if you've got a bookkeeper that's just kind of spitting this out every month, that's great. I've had businesses before, though, that if I look at things monthly, they look all over the board. When I look at things quarterly, every 3 months, then all of a sudden it gets really, really smooth, and there's much more like storytelling to be had of like, okay, we are growing over time. But it depends on the business. The other thing that I like, once I get to kind of this point, I've made one change here, and that is I added in this percentage for my gross margin. So earlier I was kind of talking to you about the fact that this top of the P&L, what's my revenue, what's the costs of goods sold for that revenue, and then I've got kind of a what's my revenue after that. If I put a percentage on that, that's 71%. If you take $71 gross revenue divided by the $100 in revenue, that's all the math that I'm doing for that. And I'm just doing that on each of the months. But that gets to a point where I can start to see trend lines in, are we getting more efficient? So in this business, you'll notice I start at 71 and I kind of climb to 74%. And that's because I'm buying bigger bags of ice or more cups at a time, and I'm getting better deals on that here. And so I can see that coming out in this number. Now my fear right now would be to have everyone in the room write down, I've got to keep track of my gross margin percentage, gross revenue divided by revenue, and kind of take the note around that. This metric may be garbage for your business. I don't know. But this type of like compare one number to another number often tickles out interesting stories about your business that become really, really critical. It might be this one. I found this is one that's probably one of the earliest that I take a look at because it does help me with some of the storytelling. But this metric may have nothing to do with your business and not matter more. Mostly I'm wanting to kind of get in the habit of like trying to look at these different steps in the process and comparing the numbers, figuring out some of those is going to kind of normalize insight. That percentage is much more normalized month to month compared to the overall dollar amounts. Yeah, Corbin.
One comment, one question. Comment is, we have people at IHUB who are experts. Matt keeps talking about nuances with your business, and we have finance experts here who will help you with the nuances of your business. The question that I wanted to ask you, Matt, have you ever been in consumer goods?
Not officially. I mean, to a degree. Like my father-in-law has that grain business. We meet once a week type of thing.
So an interesting question is, for some of these companies who import consumer goods from overseas,
Yep.
would you add in your freight and duties from overseas into your cost of goods?
I would.
You would, so do I. What about then in today's world of free shipping? Would you include, if you're going to provide free shipping to every customer, would you consider that a cost of goods?
Yeah, I would.
Yes?
I would.
Yeah, that's kind of debatable.
It is debatable, and I think you can make.
Shipping was an additional expense.
Yep. You can make an argument either direction. I think the question in my mind is, in order to provide what your kind of market offering is, what are the costs going into providing that on a regular basis? I tend to include those up in that cost of revenue or cost of goods sold. That's my general rule of thumb. Now, there's other things that do get tricky because like I'll get to a point where investors start to really scrutinize this number. And so, for example, I had an implementation team. So Spiff, my last company, we automated people's sales commissions. And so their reps, it made it really easy when a rep closed a deal, they'd get a notification on their phone from the Spiff app that said, hey, you just made $750 in commissions, fist bump. And they could go in and they could see all the details about that and everything. But to be able to do that, it took like 4 or 5 months of implementation to get all of the calculations done, mimicked to the company's calculations. There was this involved implementation process. And so we determined I had a 70-person implementation team, people on my staff that just full-time got people set up in the system. Costs for that team were a cost of goods sold. But then I was trying to raise money from investors, and I was getting a lot of scrutiny on my cost of goods sold as one of the metrics that the investors cared about. And so talking to other CFOs, I started taking the management team for my implementation team and slid them back down my P&L down lower, because they weren't implementing, they were managing the people that were implementing. And so I argued that they were an overhead, general and administrative cost type of thing, so that I could put them down lower, I could decrease my expenses up there and improve my gross revenue, and would look better to investors. And it was all kosher, it was all in the P&L, and all of that's nuanced. There's nothing in like general accounting principles in the US that said that I had to put that one place or another. But that's when you're getting into the details, you end up getting in arguments like that, of trying to figure out what am I doing with these numbers. And there is both art and science involved. I think that's an example where it was like, yeah, there was a little bit of art in saying like, hey, we're fine bringing like the management costs of this team down lower and figuring out some of that. It just depends on the business. Okay, so with that, I think that's everything that I want to hit on the P&L. So I think from here, yeah, we're going to go to balance statement next. Any questions on this document before I move on? Yeah.
Maybe a comment about, I mean, I had a hospital, so a lot more, I mean, pages and pages and pages.
Yes.
We looked at daily, hourly, because of patient. But I think people understand, what this is for is that be able to make decisions quickly. If you don't have the numbers in front of you, you can't say, gee, here's an opportunity, can I do this or not? If you don't know your numbers, you can't make decisions.
Yeah.
The more you know your numbers, you get to the point so you know exactly what number, I mean, believe it or not, my cost per day for orange juice was my key point on my P&L. And if all the things that happen in the hospital, surgeries, everything, orange juice I could track really easily, so I knew if it adjusted, something happened, I could find out what.
Yeah.
So that was just a key point. So when you're doing your P&L, you set up so you can look at trends and look at immediate things like, oh, okay, I can see that. If you don't, it sneaks up on you. And you go like, wait a minute, end of the year, 6 months worth of money. Daily, and that's your bread and butter, is the daily. You say, okay, bam, here's a problem. Why is that a problem? Or here's an opportunity. I'll duplicate this opportunity because it generates more.
Yeah. Yep. And we'll talk about, after we get through the financial statements, when we're talking metrics and dashboards, I want to spend more time on that concept, because figuring out kind of what to track to actually run the business is kind of a next step after you've got like the rudimentary understanding here. So let's go to the balance statement. So again, I'm still looking at my lemonade stand. So you can see here that as of my first month, I've got $71 of cash. I've got $5 of leftover supplies. And then I've got that stand I bought for $75 that I've got listed here because there's still value in that stand and I don't have to replace that each month. That's giving me total assets for the business of $151. Now, what this balance statement is designed to do is it's supposed to show on the top what's all my assets. On the bottom is essentially how do I have those assets? What do those assets mean? If I were to sell the stand, sell the leftover supplies, go to cash, what the bottom is showing me is, to start this in the first place, apparently I took a $100 loan from my parents. And then what's left over after that loan is $51. And that's by design so that the 151 under assets matches the 151 for the liabilities plus the owner's equity. What are the physical assets of the business? What are those worth to you as the owner? And so This will always tie out the assets to those bottom two categories combined. And that's the idea here is if I could liquidate everything in total assets, so I just had cash, I would pay the $100 back to my parents here, and then I'd be left with the $51 left over after that first month. And that's the design of the balance statement, is just to kind of understand what are the actual totals in these categories. So things like inventory, a common thing that when I'm talking to a business that has like a physical inventory, one of the first things that I often have to coach a business to get better at is like, at the end of the month, I know it's boring, but I want you to go out with a clipboard and count your inventory. And make sure, like, if that's a metric, I need to be able to know what's my inventory at the end of each month. Then if that requires like a physical count, then that's what we're going to do. Because Corbin made the comment of like getting these accurate is extremely important, because it's hard to run a business without these accurate. And sometimes getting these accurate is just boring steps like going out to the warehouse and counting bags of grain, using that example. Before I make this any more complicated though, any questions about the balance statement?
One of the things I run into with small businesses and startups is a lot of them will come in, like to some location or the garage or someplace, and they can't get the concept of, okay, I already had a desk, I already have a car, I already have all these things, I already own them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how does that benefit the business? And they can't get that concept of why that's of value.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's kind of a conversation I'd have each time, other than like, if you don't have to buy those things, if you don't have to buy the car, you don't have to buy the desk, that's one less thing that you've got to buy. Now, a part of me wants to like make the difference between like, this is my desk versus this is the business's desk. But my experience is when you're starting a startup, you don't care about that. And I don't think you should. Like, there's 1,000 things that are harder and more important to try to figure out than make sure that you're accurately kind of separating like personal. Now, I start to care on like cash. I'll absolutely, early on have a business where like they take the receipts at the end of the day and they drop into their personal bank account. And when they go out to pay payroll, they cut that out of their personal bank account. And I get after that much more aggressively, much more quickly, of saying like, yeah, let's separate and let's make sure there's a difference here. But I'd agree, those types of things that you're bringing into the business are absolutely assets to you day one. Okay, my next version of the balance statement is just the 6-month version of that. One thing that I want to call out, a P&L covers what happened during a period of time. So when I'm showing January, I'm showing the sales that happened all through January. A balance statement is showing what is the totals of accounts as of January 31st. So what's the cash in the bank as of January 31st? What's the leftover supplies? I think I switched that to inventory in a slide or two here, but what's my inventory as of January 31st? And you're calculating all of that as of the end of a period. So just a random differentiation here. Again, I like to look at things over like a month-long period, or a multi-month period, or a multi-period period, because I can start to see trend lines. I can see things like in this case, this person's paying down the loan from their parents over time. And so I can see that going down. Their assets are going up as they've got more cash in the business, as they've got more inventory sitting around. And so you can see those things going up. But if I look down at the owner's equity, it actually goes up a lot faster because the liabilities are going down. And so I can see elements of that playing out here, and I can see a little bit, and that tells me something about the health of the business. May not be the only thing that I'm looking at, but that would be something that I would generally look at and say, like, yeah, that's a healthy indicator to me of the cash flow of the business. So again, useful on the scale here. Any questions now? We're going to jump to statement of cash flows next. But any questions about the balance sheet before we move on? Okay. Okay. I've got one more slide here then for statement of cash flows, and then we'll be done with the financial statements. We'll take that as a chance to take a break for lunch. Let everyone get food. We'll probably take 5 to 10 minutes, and then as you're settling in, I'll get back up and we'll keep going, okay? So this last one here, the statement of cash flows, I'm not going to spend nearly enough time here for you to necessarily to be able to calculate it yourself. It's not that complicated, other than it tends to weave through the other two financial statements. And so figuring it out would require me, if I had like multiple screens that could show the three financial statements and like track the money through, we could get there in just a few minutes here. Mostly though, I want to help you understand how to read this. So the important note on the statement of cash flows is at the end of the statement, and if I go down to this like net change in cash, I have a beginning cash balance, I have net cash flow, and an ending cash balance. So beginning cash balance plus the net cash flow gives me an ending cash balance. And then you can see like the $71 picks up the next month here. I have a change to get to a new number, and that generally flows through this. The point of the statement of cash flows is just to track the dollars through the business. Now, you could look back at the P&L and say, doesn't the P&L do this? I've got revenue coming in, I've got costs going out, I've got a bottom number. Isn't it the same thing? And the answer is, you'd think so. And in certain businesses, they absolutely will be the same thing. But you start to get nuance, and there's nuance for a good reason in the difference between GAAP accounting and cash accounting. So the one thing that I am going to spend a minute of your lives on while we're talking about this statement of cash flows is the difference between those. The idea there is the P&L becomes much more readable if I'm being very intentional about saying that I've got revenue at the top. Things like these costs of goods sold need to be the costs of the actual goods that got sold to customers. What I mean there is, if in February they were running a sale on sugar, and so I bought $500 of sugar so that I would never have to buy sugar again, it might be a smart business decision, but it would blow up this whole statement if my February said I made $125 and I spent $600 to make that. And so my net income at the end of the day would be negative $500 or whatever the number ended up being. It'd blow it up if I showed all that sugar I bought here. So instead, I just show the sugar that I actually used to make lemonade. The rest of the sugar would come over on my balance statement as an inventory item. But tracking all of that starts to look a little bit hairy. Statement of cash flows backs out any weird math that your bookkeeper did in that to understand what did I actually do in cash. So here, that $500 that I spent on sugar would show up in February. I would show it taking out of my ending cash balance, and it would show up in here, and I would be able to see Typically under operating activities, I've got this aggregate cash spent on recurring expenses. I'd probably break that out and have like inventory called out there so that I could see like, oh, I spent a massive amount on inventory this month, and I could kind of read that. That's the intention of the statement of cash flow, is to unearth those things that I intentionally buried so that I had a smoother income statement that was more normalized month to month. I just shoved through like 20 different concepts and probably a class or two at BYU on that. Any questions though on anything of kind of the principles of what that statement of cash flows is? Okay, now that I've melted brains and talked at you about numbers for like, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes here, let's pause, let's get some food. When we come back here, we're gonna jump to a little bit more interesting concepts, at least as a business manager, on the metrics and dashboard side. So we'll take a break there. Thanks, guys.
I was thinking about moving in your direction.
And I'll get back on the mic. It always sounds weird when you first go back on the mic. Okay, I'm going to keep going, partially because we've used a lot of our time already, and I want to make sure that we don't take forever here. So I'm going to wrap up a couple important concepts, kind of rapid fire here, and then we'll go to Q&A with the group, and if anyone has questions, that's great. If not, I'm available to just hang out, so if anyone wants to chat individually, we can definitely have that conversation too. Okay, metrics and dashboards. So we just went through P&L. Another common thing that is often the responsibility of the finance guys are kind of these metrics and dashboards. Here's a pretty version in some software like Looker or SciSense or something like that. Here's another version that someone made in Google Sheets. It really doesn't matter, but one is sure a lot less expensive than the other. The one thing I would say though is I've had the question a few times in the past from people saying, what metrics should I track for my business? And my honest answer for that is I have absolutely no idea. It's like someone asking me, how should I parent my child? And I mean that very, very honestly, of like every kid is different. Like the nuance in understanding your own kid and what they actually need and things like that, I think applies super well here. I've got random suggested business metrics up here, but the things that I want you guys to kind of focus on here is half of these are financial metrics. And depending on your business, some of these might make sense, some of these won't make sense. I've got things like if I'm running, most of my businesses have been software as a service, so the recurring online software model. There's a set of metrics that I would recommend to a business doing that. Some of those metrics will apply in other markets, some of those won't. But half of this is financial metrics, but importantly, the other half aren't. And they come from all other parts of the business and are really going to depend on your business. And so, like, I'll give you an example here. I had one here, industry or company specific metrics, self-management. So Spiff, we had this software that tracked the reps' commissions. And we got a few years in and we realized we had a problem. Our software could track any complexity or weird math that a company wanted to do in calculating their commissions, and we were very proud of that fact. The flip side of that, though, was we would build out those calculations so that they worked just like the company wanted them to, and then next year the company would change their sales plans, and they wouldn't want to touch the thing. And so they'd want us to get back in, make all of the changes, and we found that was ridiculously expensive, one of the big problems about our business. And if we were doing that every year, as much of a nice service as that was, their likelihood that they churn went up. And so if we could teach them how to do the math and how to use the calculation system themselves, then it's way less expensive for us because they're doing that work rather than our team. And they were way more likely to stick around. And once we made that change, we made one of my favorite metrics, one of the my warm and fuzzy days when starting a business, is the first time that I see a job posting somewhere that requires my understanding of my tool as a prerequisite for the job. So seeing a finance role go up or a commission analyst role go up that says must have at least 2 years experience managing Spiff felt so good. But the metric that we figured out, this self-management, this is what percentage of our customers are managing this themselves versus the percentage that are expecting us to do a good chunk of it. That metric was the most important metric for Spiff. Number one metric. It doesn't exist in anyone else's business. It was unique to us, defined for us, but was the most important metric to track. What I like about this type of, taking this type of information, putting it in pretty graph form, whatever version of pretty graph form lets you actually kind of track the trends, is then you do start to get that pulse on the business and be able to understand what is going on and how do I run this business. For some people, these absolutely matter that they are daily. And there are some businesses that you've got your daily things and you're tracking that throughout the day. And if you're behind target at 3:43 p.m., then you know what you've got to do for the next hour and a half. Other businesses, this is quarterly. For Spiff, I kind of figured out like what are the things that matter, like real time, what are the things that can be a little bit delayed, but figuring out kind of the mix of those was probably the most important of my job as CFO for the business. And it was really, it's not one size fits all. And like I said, a lot of people want to say like, oh, I've got the perfect suite of metrics that I can come in and implement for your business. I'm always really suspect of that because I think it's different every time. I think it's the same as someone coming in and telling me that they know exactly how to parent my kid. Couple things, though, that I think as entrepreneurs you can think about when you think about this side of the business. What I loved to do is I would make a spreadsheet like this. So this is a Google Sheet that you're looking at. You've got like rows along the side, columns on the top. All I'm doing here is I'm making big boxes with names in them for how I want to lay out the metrics that matter for the business. And so this was really important because I had a team that did kind of my business metrics when I got up to a certain scale. But this was helpful for me to understand that like my top one, ARR is annually recurring revenue. It's a really, really important metric for a recurring business. I just wanted current total ARR as just a number at the top. And so I kind of spelled that out. And then below that, I wanted ARR by quarter. And so I would define the sizes of these things and kind of the shapes of them and the importance. And it gave them something really tangible that they could follow on that business. And then I'd go through and I would define these metrics. And so I don't expect you guys to read these, but this would let me look up like the total ARR by quarter is card number 20. If I come over here, I can find total ARR quarterly, and it will tell me, when I say that, I mean 9 quarters. And I would just get really, really explicit on kind of what I was looking for from the team on those. This isn't necessarily entrepreneurship land. When you've got 2 or 3 employees, then I don't know that you're going to be defining like this. But I think thinking about these metrics in kind of the way of like, what's the story that I really want to tell myself, if nothing else, helped me to get a better pulse earlier on the business. So that, I think, is a big part of what your finance team is doing, something to be aware of. Monthly close process. I just have this slide on here to say finance is a role where at the end of the month, there are certain things that have to be done each month to calculate all of these numbers. And it may be things like, for example, my father-in-law, it's counting inventory is one of the things that he does at the end of every month is he goes out and he counts inventory. Another one is he'll take Venmo payments. And so part of his month-end close is he goes in, he makes sure if he has a balance in Venmo that he transfers it over to the bank account so that it doesn't get lost. Because we had times where we couldn't figure out why his numbers were off, and it was because he had various amounts sitting in Venmo. And so there's boring elements of that. There's a stage at a business before you're hiring. I had the question of like, when do you hire that like VP of finance type of thing? And regardless of when you decide to pull that trigger, there's a period where maybe you've got like an outsourced bookkeeper that you're paying somewhere between like 1,000 and 3,000 a month to do your books. But that's kind of all your spend on the finance side. And during that period, that bookkeeper is not counting your inventory or is not closing out your Venmo or those types of things. This is something that entrepreneurs should do so that they can start to rely on the numbers that are being generated. As you figure out what's the list of random things that you've got to kind of make sure happen each time.
One thing I think people forget for metrics, and that is tracking your competition. And that's just as important as what you're doing is know what your competitors are doing. If you see a trend from your competitors, if you're not tracking it, you're in trouble to begin with. But that's what the metrics are for. Things that are kind of different, like Venmo or cash payments, or what your competitors doing. Kind of how many ads did they run? You know, what's their numbers on Amazon? Because that gives you a feel for the trends in the marketplace, not just your business, but what's going on. And that's why these are real important. I mean, we think, oh, they're just trends, they're just information on what my numbers. So it's always good to have that section that says, what's somebody else doing that I can track.
I agree. The one thing that I will call out there is building a startup absolutely feels like building an airplane while you fall type of thing. And so you're like putting the things and you're bolting things together and trying to get all these things together. This type of instrumentation and figuring out your metrics and stuff, it's the barometer and the altimeter and stuff like that on the front of the airplane. Does it matter? Absolutely. I care a ton. Those things will keep you alive. Will they keep you alive as much as making sure you've got wings? No. And so there's most days as an entrepreneur, you've got 70 things that have to happen today and only room to fit 4 of them in. So this is one of those things, there's plenty of time that it's not going to fit in. Usually my experience is there comes a point in the business when we call it instrumentation. And it's been regular enough that we kind of recognize like, oh, we're moving into the instrumentation phase. And it's usually this point where like no one is actively on fire enough that we can kind of reevaluate and rebuild our business metrics. So with that, I'm not going to comment on financial modeling. Like I said, that's kind of, once you've got the rest of this, it becomes pretty easy actually in my experience to predict the future. And that is magical, and happy to talk about that some other time. But I think with that, we'll call it and we'll go to Q&A. Any questions right now that anyone wants to ask while we've got the group here? Yeah.
So I run an inventory-based business.
Okay.
For most of us, we've been bootstrapping, just taking our retained earnings to buy more inventory. It's grown great. Now we're at the point where we have some very, very big deals in front of us, and we're out of cash, basically.
Okay.
Struggling with our numbers are pretty good, not perfect. This has been helpful, but struggling with the idea of taking on debt and the risk associated there.
Uh-huh.
What are your thoughts on when to take on debt?
On the personal finance side, I say don't do it. Businesses aren't personal finance, and there is a place for debt. So we did an Altabank Accelerator like 8 months ago, and in that one I had a session that was a little bit more focused on like fundraising and talked about the different kinds of fundraising. Debt is a form of fundraising, and for the right business, it can make sense. Answering the question of are you the right business is tricky, but I will say that for a heavy inventory-based business, having like an accounts receivable retainer, or there's various forms of like working capital financing that can make a ton of sense given the realities of the timing that you're experiencing. Because often you're either fulfilling big orders like you're kind of mentioning there, or you're dealing with a situation where your customers get like net 45 days or something like that, and you're literally trying to find something that just smooths that out and lets you pay after your customers have paid or something like that. So I would say there's room for it. I think a heavy inventory-based business is probably my favorite place for debt. Outside of that, there's room too, but my experience is it's making someone besides you as the founder rich. So it's your pocket that it's dipping into type of thing, and there is someone that where it makes sense, but it's rarely you as the main business owner. It can be, but that'd be kind of my quick comments. And happy to chat more specifically later or whatever.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on with your businesses that.
Oh, thanks, Nico.
There we go. Sweet. Yeah, you mentioned earlier on with your businesses that you, as the CFO, you had to make pivots early on because you saw your competition. They didn't make those pivots. I don't know if you'd be willing to share some of those examples and what you saw and how you saw it and what you did to pivot.
Yeah. So I'd say one of the biggest was, I'm trying to, you know those times where it's like you want to tell a story, but there's a story before that makes the story better, and then there's a story before, and then eventually you're just telling your entire life. I'll cut off most of that and just say that when COVID hit, a lot of people thought it was going to be bad for startups. A lot of people like froze investing in startups and things like that. And in fact, turned out that at least on the tech side, that was not the case at all. And there were 2 years there. There was about a year and a half there where it was like the best time ever to be a software startup. You were printing money. Investors were super quick to invest. But then at the end of 2021, a lot more scrutiny came down on these private tech companies. And the public markets closed up, so companies couldn't go public. So now investors are scrutinizing, like, if my companies can't go public, then why am I throwing like hundreds of millions of dollars at them? And so the funding dried up. And then a lot of these companies were selling to each other in the good times and not scrutinizing like one another's costs type of thing. And it wasn't as bad as the .com, but it was rough for a SaaS company for about 2 years there. A lot went out of business. A lot had to go through massive layoffs. And I had two benefits going into there. One of my investors saw the writing on the wall about 4 months before everyone else saw the writing on the wall. And two, I was both CFO, but I kind of wasn't relegated to the random office where they're like, look, I want to hear from you in board meetings and otherwise go away and let us actually like create stuff, which I think is sometimes the relationship with finance. And so I was able to see numbers, and we would see dips in our renewals start to come through as some of these companies started to pull back and say like, hey, I want to be more cautious about what I'm spending on and things. We saw a lot of that earlier. And so during that period, there were trackers that you could find online that would show what percentage of all tech employees were laid off this month. And by all, I mean all across the country. And those percentages were showing like, 11% of all tech employees got laid off this month type of thing. And 9% the next month. And said like, it was a rough period where a lot of these companies were going through massive layoffs. By being able to notice that earlier, we kicked off a number of things. And it's tricky to give like all of the like very specific, we did this and we did this and we did this type of things. But I had the advantage where like I was both running the numbers and one of the main co-founders of the business, where we could adjust pretty dramatically. And we were able to go through that period without any layoffs. which was huge in our industry, kind of unheard of in our industry. And we're able to do a couple other things that like shored up the team. But it was tricky. I mean, ultimately, prior to that, the feedback we were getting from investors was absolutely spend at all cost. And I was burning $4 million a month. And so you might as well just like throw it in a furnace type of thing, burning $4 million a month. And we had to, in like 9 months, get that down to like 1.5 million. And that was a hard adjustment in the business. But I think had we been like 5 months later, it would have been a disaster. Like having 9 months to do that rather than 4 months to do that gave us the time to be able to pull out of a dive and make big changes. And for me, markets change. It's one of the, like, you get used to a market a certain way, but anyone that's been out for like a decade or 2 or 3 starts to feel like, yeah, these cycles come around and you've got to be able to kind of respond to them. So something like this will happen for the next stage of whatever companies are coming out the door.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay, thanks guys. I'll stick around if anyone has any individual questions. Appreciate you having me.
Don't it let